Now for our keynote speaker, Donald Moore, who is the Executive Director from the Global Dairy Platform. Donald is coming all the way live from Chicago, so fingers crossed we'll have a good internet connection. Donald will be taking your questions live, so make sure to get texting.
Donald Moore, I'm the Executive Director of the Global Dairy Platform based here in Chicago, Illinois. Originally born, though, in Coleraine, Northern Ireland, and so we left there, gosh, in the early 70s when I was about 11, and we moved to New Zealand. And before I moved up here to the States 10 years ago to run Global Dairy Platform, I did spend 10 years with a little dairy company down in New Zealand called Fonterra that perhaps a few of you will have heard of. And in my time with Fonterra, I was fortunate enough to have traveled around the world and represented them on the joint venture boards of, well, on the boards of most of their joint venture companies in different parts of the world, whether it was China, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, South Africa, Israel, parts of Europe, and so on. And so I was always intrigued by the opportunity to go and visit with farmers in different parts of the world. And I guess what I discovered in my travels on behalf of Fonterra was that the accents changed, but the issues didn't really change. And the passion that farmers demonstrate for this industry didn't change. Doesn't matter what part of the world you're in. So 10 years ago, I joined Global Dairy Platform, and I'm going to talk to you today about the future of the global food system and what do we think the role is for dairy. And I thought I'd start off by, if I may have the next slide, please, by just sharing with you a definition that comes from the FAO about what is a global food system. And look, this definition's been around for a while. It's they republished it in 2020. But from my perspective, the thing I think is important about this particular definition of the food system is what it says at the bottom here. And the emphasis here was mine, not theirs. But really, it needs to make sure that the food system is profitable, ensuring economic stability, has broad-based benefits for society, and securing social stability, and that has a positive or neutral impact for the natural resource environment, safeguarding the sustainability of the environment. But I love the fact that it talks about the need for sustainability in all of those different dimensions. But let's talk about dairy story. The dairy story, we often talk about a 1 billion people strong community being dairy, and I'll explain that in a moment. But there are around 1 billion people whose livelihoods depend upon the dairy sector worldwide, serving around 6 billion consumers on a regular basis with high quality nutritional products. And dairy farmers around the world, well, you're looking after for about 20% of the world's agricultural land, you're caring for them. And at a global level, milk and milk products provide around 5% of the energy that is in people's diets, 10% of the protein, and about 9% of the fat. Next slide, please. The other thing I wanted to mention was dairy is relevant, incredibly relevant from a socioeconomic perspective. So these are the numbers that underpin this story of 1 billion people. There are, by some estimates from FAO, 133 million dairy farms in the world. There are some 600 million people who live on those dairy farms. There's then a further 400 million people whose livelihoods depend upon the dairy farm upstream and downstream from the farm, creating a total of 240 million jobs. And then from a UN perspective, one of the things that they are very impressed with from the dairy sector is the engagement with youth and women and other disadvantaged groups. And there are some 37 million farms in the world that are actually led by women, and 80 million women engaged in dairy farming to some extent. Next slide, please. Dairy is also a responsible sector, and there are some 363 million cows in the world, and we're going to talk a little more about the sustainability challenges we have in the dairy sector. But when you start thinking about dairying on a global scale, and we talk about farm sizes, etc., and those of us based in Ireland, or I am now in the US, or previously I was in New Zealand, we tend to think of herds as being reasonably large. In Ireland, I think the average is around 80 cows at the moment. But in most of the developing world, the average herd size is 2 to 3 cows. And in fact, less than 0.3% of farms in the world have actually more than 100 cows. So dairy is an industry with an extremely long tail of small-scale businesses right around the world. And in fact, dairying is conducted in virtually every country of the world as well. Next slide, please. And the other thing we want to mention is the impact that dairy has around the world. It is one of the most valuable agricultural commodities worldwide. It ranks third in terms of production tonnage, but it ranks first overall in terms of value created from a commodity, and it contributes around 27% of the global value add from livestock, 10% of the global value add from agriculture, and 14% of global agricultural trade. Now, all of the numbers I've been quoting to you here come from the UN's Food and Agricultural Organization. So this is the UN's view of our dairy industry. But I think it's fair that we acknowledge, next slide please, we acknowledge that we do have some challenges as well. And the biggest challenge that tends to get pointed out to us when we're out there representing dairy on the global stage is really the challenge around our environmental impact, and particularly greenhouse gases. Now, we need to recognize that all agriculture has an impact on greenhouse gases. It's not just livestock and it's not just dairy. All of agriculture produces around 24% of the man-made greenhouse gas emissions in the world. Livestock's around 14.5% of that, and dairy is 2.5%. And in a study we launched last year, which we did in conjunction with the FAO, looking at greenhouse gas emissions from the dairy sector, they did an analysis between 2000 and 2015, and they determined that in that time period, greenhouse gas emissions reduced by 11% in intensity from the dairy sector globally, and indeed they reduced in every region of the world. So from a environmental impact, particularly greenhouse gases, we're heading in the right direction from an intensity perspective. We need to also look at absolute emissions, and during that time period, entire milk production in the world, that 10-year period, it grew 30%. So milk increased by 38%, but total emissions only increased by 18%. So we're on the right track, but we still need to work on that absolute emissions. And from a global perspective, we're committed to reducing all agricultural greenhouse gas emissions by all economically viable means. That's the strategy we have in place. And there's two programs that I'll talk a little bit about later on that we have that are working on that. One is a thing called the Dairy Sustainability Framework, and the second is a project that we are just in the process of launching at the moment called Net Zero Pathways to Low Carbon Dairy, and the emphasis needs to be on the pathways component of that. So that's just a little bit of context to set the scene. Next slide, please. So what's happening in the world today? And we'll just go straight on to the next slide, if we may. Everyone's aware of the population growth. You know, the UN Statistical Agency is forecasting that there will be 10 billion people on the face of this planet by 2050. And that in order to feed that population, we're going to need to produce around 70% more food than we do today. Next slide. And there are a whole raft of people who have an opinion on the food system that's out there at the moment. You've got all these different pundits coming out with their claims that we need to move from our current food system. It's broken. We need to change it to a food system that is more respectful of the planet, that puts more emphasis on plant versus animal sourced foods, et cetera, et cetera. You've got the Eat Lancet Commission coming out with their planetary health diets, etc. And a lot of the people who are focusing in this area have been focused very much on the consumption end of the equation. Very few of them have really thought about the totality of a food system, the production through consumption, and then the recycling of the byproducts and the co-products from the food system. And so we as the dairy sector, next slide please, or next build I should say, we also produced a report back in, I think it was 2017, we launched it, which was a report of 27 global experts, academics from around the world we pulled together, and they called it the Chicago Consensus on Sustainable Food System Science, and really promoted this idea that we as a world, we need to start thinking about the food production and food consumption as a closed loop system, and one in which the byproducts from one feed into the other. Next slide, please. Well, back in 2019, then, during the UN Committee on World Food Security, their annual meeting happened in October 2019, and during that, this gentleman, who's the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, he announced that he wanted to hold a food systems summit in 2021. Now, this is extremely important because it's been over 25 years since the UN as a whole considered food. And so 25 years ago was the last time they had a summit on food. And on this occasion, we were very pleased that the Secretary General called this a food systems summit. Next slide, please. And so the Food Systems Summit has been set for late 2021. They have yet to confirm the date. I don't know whether that's COVID related, or I heard there were some debates as to whether this particular meeting should be in Rome, where the agricultural agencies of the UN are based, or whether it will be in New York, where the more political end of the UN sits. But in any event, the meeting will happen in late 2021. And the outcomes they're looking from this meeting is they're really looking for significant action and commitment to action with measurable outcomes and impacts that will allow them to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. They're looking for dramatically elevated public discussion about the importance of food system leading to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And they really want to find ways to get the public working together for people and planet. They also want to build a high-level set of principles established through the process that will guide member states and other stakeholders to leverage their food systems capacity in support of the Sustainable Development Goals. And obviously, they want to build a follow-up system so they can track progress, etc. This is really being done as part of the UN's Decade of Action on Nutrition. And I think it's fair to say we're 5 years into the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals that will deliver equitable, sustainable future for all people on the planet by 2030. We're 5 years into that, and I think it's fair to say we're not actually tracking the way we need to if we're going to deliver on them. There are 5 platforms that they have defined, or 5 action networks that they've defined within this Food Systems Summit. And I'll just mention the names of them. I think it gives you a sense of what they're trying to do here. The first action track they call ensuring access to safe and nutritious food for all. And that to me is really follows up on the UN's mandate about the realization of the right to food. The second one is shifting to sustainable consumption patterns. Now that does concern me a little bit because there are a number of people who are looking at that as a move towards more plant-based food systems, and it is being led, that action track is being led by EAT, by Gunhild Stordalen, the founder of EAT. But we're still hopeful that we can have a positive impact on that. The third is about boosting nature-positive production at sufficient scale, and I think this is important. Looking at the issues around climate change and the need to reduce emissions, etc., while also recognizing that we need to produce more food. So how do we boost that nature-positive production at scale? And then advancing equitable livelihoods and value distribution. So this recognition that farmers need to be paid for the food that they are producing at an equitable rate. We need to think about inclusion, particularly in rural communities, and promoting full and productive employment and decent work for all. And then last, but I guess in the current environment by no means least, they're looking at building resilience to vulnerabilities, shocks and stresses. And given the current COVID environment, I think that's an entirely appropriate thing for them to be doing here. So that's the outline to the Food Systems Summit that's coming up next year. And what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about what the dairy sector is doing to prepare. So could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So what are we as a dairy sector doing to prepare? And I've actually subcalled this the road beyond the Food Systems Summit, because I think, you know, the work that the Global Dairy Platform's been involved with for probably the last 6 years or so is really about developing and producing evidence. And that's evidence that helps to explain the complexity of issues. But it doesn't allow us to shy away nor to minimize the challenges that we face, but it helps us to seek solutions to the myriad problems we face in the world. And as I mentioned before, that's a world that's going to have some 10 billion people on it by 2050, all people who are trying to lead healthy and meaningful lives on a planet that has got finite resources. In my opinion, the answer to the question of a resilient and sustainable food system is not about revolution, it's about evolution. We need to respect and support all farmers and farming systems, be they intensive or extensive, be they large or small, highly automated or very traditional. we need to recognize that all agriculture, including the dairy sector, must do and can do more to reduce its environmental footprint, improve animal welfare, while simultaneously enhancing farm livelihoods and food quality. So in terms of what we've been doing at Global Dairy Platform to prepare the case for the dairy sector, if I could have the next slide, please. I want to share with you a timeline. And this is really a timeline which, gosh, I've started it back in 2015, really, with the launch of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and then through to the Food Systems Summit. But really the work we're doing goes much, much further beyond that. And I want to just share with you briefly some of the things we've been doing to position the dairy sector. Next slide, or next click, please. First thing we did was in 2016, we got very involved in a UN Committee on World Food Security negotiation about the role of livestock in sustainable food systems. And the final report coming out there specifically mentioned the importance of dairy to pregnant lactating women and youth. And so positive recognition of the value of dairy and the value of livestock. Next slide, next click, please. Around the same time, we also got involved in a group called the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock. Could I have the next click? Thank you, and one more. And then working with the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock in 2017, we convinced them to launch a subgroup called Livestock for Social Development. Just keep, next click, please. Around that same time, the UN Committee on World Food Security produced a report on nutrition and food systems, and we had one of our sector leads as a author of that report. Now, that was significant for several reasons. It was the first time in the history of the UN Committee on World Food Security that they ever had a representative of the private sector working on one of these expert reports. Sad to say, it was also the last time. They haven't picked up another one since then. But it was extremely important from our perspective that we started to engage in this dialogue and discussion around food systems. And if you just next click, please. There is, coming out of that, there is a series of voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition that are currently under negotiation, and they will be a major input into the Food Systems Summit when it comes along. And we've been involved right the way through in those negotiations to make sure that the dairy sector overall is well positioned. Next slide, please, or next click. Then at the same time, we've been working through this Livestock for Social Development to produce a series of reports co-authored with the UN about the value of dairying in the world. So this first one was Dairy and Poverty. It was launched in 2018. Next click, please. Around the same time, we have started an initiative called the Dairy Impact Methodology to measure the socio-economic impact of dairying in the world. And that particular initiative is co-led by both FAO and IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development. And I've got a report coming up in a few clicks from now that'll be launched early next year that looks at the socio-economic impact of dairy in 120 countries around the world, and I believe Ireland to be one of those countries. Next click, please. In 2019, I mentioned this one before, we produced this report, which was greenhouse gas emissions from the dairy cattle sector worldwide, which is the report that had the 11% reduction in total emission, emission intensity from the dairy sector. Next slide, next click. In 2019, we also launched an initiative called Dairy Nourishes Africa. And what happened was at our board, they decided that it would be a great idea if we move from just talking about the good that dairy can do in the world to starting to demonstrate it. And so we have this initiative, Dairy Nourishes Africa. It's currently running pilots in East Africa, looking at how the dairy sector can be used as a catalyst to help tackle issues facing society, particularly malnutrition of children and pregnant and lactating women. And so building the dairy sector up at a local level, helping to produce profitable returns to farmers and processors, and to deliver nutrition to vulnerable groups in those communities. Next click, please. I'm going to talk about this one in a moment. It's the Dairy Sustainability Framework. It was launched back in 2013, but in 2019, we started producing a series of annual reports from this. We produced both the 2018 and 2019 data reports, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Also in 2020, we've launched the second paper in the series. Next click, please. The next paper in the series of these papers co-authored with the UN. This one is around dairy's impact on reducing global hunger in the world. Then next click, please. We've just been appointed as Global Dairy Platform to a member of the business guiding group for the Food Systems Summit. And that's very important from our perspective, because it means that as Global Dairy Platform, on behalf of the dairy sector, we're sitting inside the steering group, or the steering house, the wheelhouse of this Food Systems Summit that's coming up, and so that we can make sure that the dairy sector is well represented. Now, 2 reports coming out, if I can just have 2 clicks here, please. 2 reports coming out in 2021. The first at the bottom of the screen is the Dairy Impact Analysis report that I mentioned, based on the Dairy Impact methodology. That's going to look at 120 countries around the world, and then we're going to do a deep dive subsequently into 5 of those countries. And then the report at the top of the screen is the next report in our series of dairy and the SDGs, and that is dairy's role in improving gender equality and youth access to employment, using the dairy sector as an example. So if I could just have next slide, please. I wanted to quickly talk about, in my last couple of minutes, the different projects that we have underway, one being the Dairy Sustainability Framework. Next click. The Dairy Sustainability Framework I mentioned before was launched in 2013. It now represents around, next click please. We now represent, through the Dairy Sustainability Framework, around 30% of the world's dairy production, but that represents closer to 50% of the formal milk in the world. In fact, I think it's 48% of the formal milk market is reporting its progress through dairy. Ireland's represented in here through Board BIA, which is an aggregator for the Dairy Sustainability Framework. The framework tracks and reports globally on the continuous improvement of the dairy sector against 11 criteria. If you just give me the next slide, please. Probably a little hard to see on here, but here is a report that literally came out yesterday and is available on the Dairy Sustainability website. It tracks those 11 indicators, reporting progress year on year. So we can use this information when we're sitting in UN meetings to talk about the good work of the dairy sector in terms of addressing its sustainability challenges across economic, social, and environmental dimensions. And then last, please, my last slide, or nearly my last slide. I mentioned this project earlier, Net Zero Pathways to Low Carbon Dairy. And this is another initiative that we have underway that we're working with the UN on at the moment. The emphasis being on the pathways component here. The big challenge we've got with the dairy sector, and particularly with greenhouse gas emissions in parts of the world, is that it's not the developed world, it's not the Irelands, it's not the Netherlands, it's not the New Zealands that a lot of these UN agencies are worried about. They're more worried and concerned about countries such as Ethiopia or Tanzania or Bangladesh, where their average greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of milk produced range somewhere between 12 to 20 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of milk produced, where I guess in Ireland, I think you're sitting at 1.3, 1.4 at the moment. Netherlands is about 1.2. So they're more concerned about some of these parts of the world that are very large herds with very low yields producing a lot of greenhouse gases. And so the strategy in here is working with the Food and Agricultural Organization to develop a series of simple paths that can be adopted by farmers in different parts of the world, just adopting the best practices that you already use in Ireland. A lot of it's to do with the way that the animals are cared for, so animal care, animal feeding, watering, just animal husbandry practices that we've seen in Tanzania, and the work we're doing there can have a major impact on yield improvement. And if we can improve yield, we reduce the emission intensity. So last slide then, what is the future of the globe? Last slide. What is the future of the global food system, and what's the role for dairy? Well, something I should have mentioned right at the start, and I know you've got a friend of mine, Zoe Kavanagh, who runs the National Dairy Council in Ireland, talking tomorrow, and she's going to talk about consumers. The first thing we should never lose sight of is that consumers love dairy. Second thing I wanted to stress to you is you have a fantastic story. You need to be part of telling that story. You know, the dairy, as I've mentioned before, is relevant. It's relevant nutritionally and socially. It is responsible environmentally. And, you know, we have our challenges, and the first thing we should be doing is admitting we have challenges, but we are proactively working on them in all parts of the world. And that's where this issue of responsibility comes forward. And last but by no means least, you know, the dairy sector has incredible impact economically around the world. We're prepared to proactively represent the dairy sector in these global discussions on the future of food. And in order to feed a growing world population, we're going to require all solutions: animal-sourced food, plant-sourced foods, big farms, small farms, highly mechanized farms, highly traditional farms. And I think, last click, please, you know, the message I would leave you with, the overarching conclusion, is that dairy is a vital component of the global food system. Now, I didn't mention it earlier, but one of the things that we did recently was we had our annual meeting, and we invited the Secretary General of the, Director General of FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, as our keynote speaker. And he shared with us a bunch of statements about how the dairy sector plays a critical role in sustainable food systems and contributes directly to delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. He talked about how milk and milk products are essential to nutritious, healthy, and diverse diets. We have made an impact already on the UN in representing the dairy sector. We have a terrific story. We need to make sure that over the next year, both at the Food Systems Summit, at the Climate Change Summit that's going to come after that in Glasgow, that we are there representing the dairy sector and really doing our best, putting our best foot forward.